Good morning. So let me tell you what we've been doing for the last 3 or 4 weeks and for the next 2 or 3 weeks. As a church, we made a decision to walk through the Gospel of Luke, starting at chapter 9. Why chapter 9? Because chapter 9 is that moment in Luke's Gospel when Jesus turns from his ministry in Galilee of teaching and healing the sick and starts marching toward Jerusalem, toward the cross, toward the resurrection. And as he turns and starts walking toward the cross, he begins to teach his disciples about what it means to follow him. He finds himself consistently in conflict with the religious leadership around him. And sometimes in this journey on the way to the cross, he makes statements that are difficult and troubling. So we've been reading this together. If you haven't been reading, just start reading at chapter 9. You can catch up. We've got plenty of time to get to Easter. But one of the interesting things that's happened as we're reading along is we'll read some passages that are difficult and hard to read and hard to understand. So for those of you who are new, I want you to understand I'm intentionally preaching on the passages that are some of the more difficult ones because I want to wrestle with them with you. Let me make this point to you, is if you will wrestle with it and work with it and ask questions, God will give something to you. Now, I want to ask you a question. Are you ready today for the most difficult passage in the whole Gospel of Luke? Okay. I warned you. Are you ready, Sue? Absolutely. Pray for me. You're going to watch me hem and haw and squirm. Okay. Luke 14, verse 25. A large crowd was following Jesus. He turned around and said to them, "If you want to be my disciple, you must by comparison hate everyone else. Your father, mother, wife, and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. But don't begin until you count the cost, for who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everyone would laugh at you, and they would say, 'There's the person who started that building and couldn't afford to finish it.' Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselor to discuss whether his army of 10,000 could defeat the 20,000 soldiers marching against him? And if he can, he will send a delegation to discuss the terms of peace while the enemy is still far away. So you cannot become my disciple unless you give up everything you own. Salt is good for seasoning, but if it loses its flavor, how do you make it salty again? Flavorless salt is good neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown away. And let this be our prayer. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. Lord, give me some ears to listen. Please help me understand. Woo! Well, thank you very much, Jesus. Happy Sunday. Aren't you glad you came this morning? One of the most difficult passages in the Gospel of Luke, one of the most difficult passages that I would just rather avoid. Kenan, who's up here on the front rows doing the prayer today, sent me an email this week and was preparing for his prayer and read the scripture and sent me an email and just said, "Good luck!" exclamation point. If it were, if it were completely up to me, well, I guess it is up to me, I would prefer just kind of a Jeffersonian approach, Thomas Jefferson took Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, took a pair of scissors and cut out all the parts he didn't like. Cut out all the miracles, cut out anything that was supernatural, pasted it all back together, and put together his own Bible. Would anybody like to borrow my scissors and just cut this one out? Because we got a problem here. It's hard to understand. It doesn't seem to fit with our understanding of Jesus. Now you think, we got a problem. Imagine those poor disciples. Peter left his fishing business behind to follow Jesus. Matthew left behind his government job, working for the man, to follow Jesus. And Judas was with this rebel movement. He left the rebels behind to join Jesus, a new rabbi. And they're following Jesus, and they're gaining momentum all throughout Galilee. Crowds are gaining and building, and it's exciting. They're the front row seats to spectacular miracles and great teaching. And then Jesus turns toward Jerusalem and starts saying things like, the Son of Man is going to suffer many things at the hands of angry men, going to die on a cross, and you need to pick up yours. And it's not exactly a friendly message. And so, crowds get smaller. Then he picks a fight with every religious leader on his way to Jerusalem, and the crowds get even smaller. And then his teaching gets more difficult, and the crowds get even smaller. But then we read here in this particular passage that for some reason or another, a large crowd has gathered around Jesus. And I imagine, reading between the lines, Peter looking at Matthew saying, okay, maybe we can get some new momentum here. We got a big crowd. I'll go talk to him. Peter walks over to Jesus and says, hey, Jesus, it's been a rough few weeks here. Maybe you notice the crowds are getting a little smaller. This would be a good time to pill out a message that sort of wins people over. So I got suggestions. We've written down some topics for you. Why don't you preach on 5 ways to win at life? Preach on the path to peace, or how to build a happy family. So Jesus walks over to the podium, steps up. The crowd is eager. The disciples are excited. He taps on the microphone a couple times, clears his throat, and everyone's leaning forward, and he says, if you want to be my disciple, you must hate your father and mother, your wife, and your children, and even your own life. Dead silence. Peter looks at Matthew and says, well, I hope they haven't sold my boat. Matthew says, well, maybe I can get my corporate job back. And Judas says, well, I guess I need to get a new resume. Peter walks over to Jesus and says, I think we got a problem, Jesus. Well, I feel their pain. I do. I was the one that signed you up to read through Luke's gospel. If I hadn't signed you up, you would have never read that. I wouldn't be up here explaining it to you, hemming and hawing and squirming. But I did it. I divided up the gospel of Luke into some bite-sized chunks and gave it to you, and you're all excited. You pick up the Bible. We're going to read the Bible. We're going to read every day, and you're reading every day. You're checking off the boxes, and then you get to this one. Oh, I have to choose between my family and God? What's going on here? Or even worse, you're here today for the first time on Sunday, and you walked in and you saw this Ichabod Crane looking dude up there saying, you need to hate your family. And you're wondering, is he going to tell me who to vote for, and when's he going to bring out the snakes and the poison? Well, we got a problem here. Because, hate is a terrible word. It's an awful word. And our world right now has been bloodied by hate. Everywhere we see it in our own community in the world, hate is destroying our world. And then to hear those words come out of the mouth of Jesus, that word hate, it doesn't sound like him and it feels awful, doesn't it? I mean, because we've read in the whole context of the whole story of Jesus' story in the Gospel of Luke, he is the embodiment of unconditional love. Everything about Jesus is all about love. When the angels appeared in the sky on the day he was born, and an angel said, I bring you good news of great joy for all the people. And he meant all people. Tax collectors. He loved the lepers. He loved the sick. He loved the poor. He loved the rich. He loved the slave. He loved the free. He loved men. He loved women. He loved prostitutes. He loved the rejects. He loved the outcasts. He loved the failures. He loved those who were riddled with doubt and confusion and who were out of their minds. He loves you. And he loves me. And then, you read, right before, if you go back and you read it in context, you know what happens right before this disastrous sermon? He tells a story about a big banquet in the kingdom of God and how everyone, because of his great love, the sick, the poor, the lame, the reject, the criminal, the prisoner, are going to be welcome to sit at the head of the table. And then after he delivers the sermon, you go, what's going on here? Because he tells the story of a family. There's a son who says, Dad, I want it all right now. I'm not willing to wait. Son leaves home and goes down to River Spirit Casino and blows it all on the tables. Comes home busted, broke, sick, tired, ashamed, humiliated, to beg for mercy for his dad, and his dad had every reason to hate him. But instead, his dad runs up to him and hugs him and loves him and throws a party for him. And then who is the villain in the story? The elder brother hating on the little brother. Now we're confused because when we read these stories, we know that there is no hate in Jesus. A few years ago, Westboro Baptist Church, it's not really a church, it's really a hate group, from Kansas, showed up in our neighborhood down the street at our church, at another church, and held up signs that said, God hates gay people. That's not a church, and that's not God. That's just mean, hateful people. There is no hate in Jesus. So I find it hard to believe that Jesus would tell me to hate my mother and father when the fifth commandment says, love your mother and father and honor them. I find it hard to believe that Jesus would tell me to hate my wife when it says, Jesus says, when you get married, you'll be joined to your wife, you'll leave your parents behind, and you'll become one flesh. I find it hard to believe that Jesus says, hate your children, when he said, let the children come unto me. And I do not believe with every ounce of my being that Jesus would ever ask me to choose between him and my family or my parents or my kids. And if he did, I'd probably say what you would say. No, thank you. But I do know this. However, if you decide to follow Jesus Christ with your life, and you decide that you want to be his student and his disciple, it's not going to be easy. And you may end up making decisions that will put you at odds with your family. When my mom and dad found out that I'd been born again, that I'd given my life to Jesus and had a moment with God that just lit me up on fire for God, they were excited. When I came home from church camp and said, God has called me to be a pastor, they were excited. When I announced that I was going to go to Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas, 30 minutes from my home, they were excited. When I came home on the weekends for breakfast and for them to do my laundry, they were still excited. But then on the day, because the dream that God put on my heart, that I loaded up everything that I owned in the back of a little truck and backed out of my driveway and drove to Nashville, Tennessee to go to Vanderbilt Divinity School, I'll never forget seeing the tears rolling down my mother's face and how it broke her heart. She didn't say this, but I imagine her thinking this. Jesus, I liked it when you called him, but I thought you were going to call him to live in my neighborhood. And you know what I'm talking about, because many of you grew up in the church perhaps, and you grew up in a church and you have lots of fond memories of the church that you grew up in, and you may not remember preachers or Sunday school teachers, but you remember the people that were important to you. But then as you grew up and you got bigger and you began to go off to the university and you began to study and think and reflect and you began to rub up against other kinds of people and you began to realize that God's a lot bigger than the little box of the church I grew up in. And so because of that, you had to leave because of the dream that God put in your heart of how you were understanding God was so much bigger, not dismissing what you grew up with, but you could no longer stay there. You had to leave the religion of your parents. Some of you have had to leave behind the hate of your parents, the prejudice of your parents, the racism of your parents, the place you grew up. Some of you perhaps, your dad wanted you, or mom wanted you to go off to grad school because they wanted you to make a good living. They wanted you to be a lawyer. They wanted you to be a doctor. They wanted you to be an actuary. But instead, you went off to music school and became a choral conductor. Or that's a great example, isn't it? Actually, his dad was a choral conductor, so he followed in his dad's footsteps. But you get the point. When Christ is a part of your life, he's going to put a dream on your heart. And what he's saying here, he's not saying you should hate someone. And actually, the word there in the Greek, it doesn't mean the same thing in English. You can't really adequately translate it, and I'll just botch it up. All I can tell you, it doesn't mean the same thing. What he's saying here is that when Christ becomes a part of your life and you become his student and his disciple, it's going to put you in situations that's going to cause test and put pressure on your primary relationships, and that you're going to have an identity that becomes larger than the one you had before. Because for a Jewish family, this was shocking because their whole identity was their family. And so he is saying, if you're going to be my disciple, I'm going to become your priority. Doesn't mean you're not going to love your family, but you're going to follow me in my dream, and it may push you out of your comfort zones, and not everyone is going to be happy with the decisions that you will be making. You see, Jesus was just a troublemaker. We want to make him into a unicorn who sells daisies or something. He was just a problem from the very beginning. The whole thing about him, the way he was born in a stable. He was born in Palestine. His mother was a teenage virgin. His father was a carpenter. The first people that heard the news were just smelly shepherds. And look at the 12 people he called to be disciples, and he associated with the demon-possessed, the sick, the diseased, the leper, the prostitutes. He didn't do anything that anybody expected. And he was always making shocking statements all the time. He was always using hyperbole. Poke out the eye, cut off the arm, if it causes the sin. And so he used shocking language to make sure that we understand that he is calling us to be a part of his plan to bring redemption and love to a world filled with hate. And the problems get even more difficult. I mean, we hear the word cross, pick up your cross and follow me, and we think, yeah, I have a cross to bear, I'm married to Mary. Or this burden I'm carrying, this illness that's not what it means. In that culture, when Jesus said cross, it was shocking. Because a cross was what the Romans used as a form of humiliation and brutality and punishment. They didn't understand what Jesus was saying. But this is what he was saying to them. Because the moment you picked up a cross and you began to carry it, you were saying to the world, I am guilty. And so what was he saying to his disciples and to us and to anyone who would follow him? If you want to be my disciple, you need to pick up a cross and you need to carry it. And you need to let the world know that I am guilty. What you're doing and what I'm doing when we pick up the cross and we say, I'm guilty, we are saying, I'm just like everyone else. I'm not any better than anyone else. My religion has not made me better than anyone else. I don't have any privileged status over anyone else. I'm just like everyone else in the world. And we are approaching the world not from a point of view of judgment and pointing our finger, but from a place of humility and saying, I have no legs to stand on. No moral high ground. I'm just like you. But this cross I'm carrying, for you, he carried for me. He took it all on himself. And when I'm carrying this cross, I'm reminding myself that I'm guilty, and it was by his love and grace and forgiveness that I am free. Friends, when we start coming at the world from that position, from living this cause that we're going to live into the unconditional, it's going to put pressure on us when we start saying I'm guilty, because he says, count the cost. There is a cost involved. Discipleship is hard. Unfortunately, in the world, in the church, we don't want to tell people the whole story. We do no one no favors when we just tell them what God can do for us, but we don't say what we need to do for God. I call it Christian light. It tastes great, but it's less filling. That's an old commercial. And so when he says salt and flavor here, a discipleship that costs us nothing has no taste to it. And to make an impact or to make a difference in the world, to follow him, there's a cost, because you see, Jesus wasn't about hate. He wasn't about exclusion. He was about inclusion. And if we're going to follow him, it's going to test our relationships, because it's going to mean that we're going to love everybody. It doesn't matter who you are, we're going to love you. Doesn't matter where you came from, we're going to love you. Doesn't matter what's happened to you, we're going to love you. We're not going to judge you. We're not going to point a moral. We're going to love you. We're going to get messed up. We're going to get dirty. And I would ask our church, are we willing to get messy? Or are we just a country club that put the name Disciples of Christ on the sign out front? Are we willing to get messy? He says, if you want to bring flavor and to be unique and to be useful in the world, follow me. But that's not going to be easy. So one last thing. If you're a parent or a grandparent, do not, under any circumstance, tell your children about Jesus if you want to keep them in some little box that you've designed for them. I'm not saying you design a box for them. And let me say this the best way that I can. We don't need our children and youth to follow in our footsteps, because we've handed them a world on fire. And our sin and complicity has messed up and broken this world. We don't need them to follow in our footsteps. We need God to put a dream in their hearts so they can help the world be a better place. So don't tell them about Jesus, because they might just move to Nashville.